The October sun blazed merciless across Whiskey Ridge Range, turning the California high desert into a furnace of wavering air and broken dreams. At 8,500 feet elevation, where the Sierra Nevada mountains clawed at thin atmosphere, Gunnery Sergeant Wade Garrett watched his career disintegrate one bullet at a time. Shot number 127 screamed downrange at 2,800 feet per second, carrying with it 15 years of Marine Corps pride, 3 previous combat deployments, and the desperate hopes of 4 elite warriors who trained their entire lives for this moment. The bullet missed. 4 minutes right of center, again. Garrett's roar echoed off the granite walls like artillery fire. "This is unacceptable. We deploy in 48 hours, and we can't hit a stationary target at 1,700 yards. His face had gone purple, veins standing out on his neck like rope. Sweat darkened his desert camouflage utilities despite the October chill. Behind him, 3 more Force Recon Marines stood frozen at their equipment stations, watching their team leaders melt down with the sick certainty of men witnessing their own professional execution. Staff Sergeant Natalie Brennan lowered her spotting scope, auburn hair plastered to her forehead beneath her boonie cap. Her hands trembled slightly as she keyed her radio. Wind reading confirmed at 15 miles per hour from the northwest. Barometric pressure 29.85. Humidity 32%. Temperature 68 degrees. All environmental data locked. The Kestrel 5700 Elite weather meter mounted to her scope bracket blinked its cold digital certainty. $8,000 of precision meteorological equipment calibrated that morning, certified accurate to .01 decimal places. The kind of technology that had guided successful shots in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and a dozen classified locations where American snipers had reached out across impossible distances to touch death. Technology that was somehow impossibly catastrophically wrong. Corporal Jameson Caldwell worked the bolt of his Barrett M82A1 50 caliber rifle, the massive weapon dwarfing even his 6-foot frame. His Scottish ancestry showed in the red-gold stubble on his jaw and the pale skin now burned pink by high-altitude sun. 25 years old, married 8 months, his wife Melissa, 8 months pregnant with twins. He'd spent every spare moment of the past year preparing for this qualification, knowing that deployment meant a $15,000 hazardous duty bonus that would cover the twins' first year of life. "Ballistic solution confirmed," he said, voice tight with controlled panic. "Computer says hold 2.3 minutes left for wind drift. Coriolis effect calculated. Spin drift accounted for. Range verified by laser at 1,700 yards exactly." The Schmidt and Bender scope mounted to his rifle had cost $21,000. The ballistic computer strapped to his wrist could calculate firing solutions faster than most men could read a sentence. Every variable had been measured, quantified, digitized, and solved. Yet the bullets kept missing. 4.2 minutes right, every single shot. Sergeant Marcus Whitfield stood at the ammunition station, his tall Texan frame casting a long shadow across the sandbag shooting position. 32 years old, a career Marine who'd grown up on a ranch outside Amarillo, where his father had taught him to shoot jackrabbits at 400 yards with iron sights. That same father now lay dying in a San Antonio hospice, pancreatic cancer, eating through his final weeks. The old man had been a Marine II Force Recon in the first Gulf War, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that his father was hanging on just long enough to hear that his son had made it to combat deployment one more time. One more mission. One more chance to make the old man proud before the cancer took him. Marcus checked his watch. They had 6 hours left in their qualification window. Failed today and 2nd Battalion would take their deployment slot. Failed today and 4 careers ended in shame. Failed today and Marcus's father would die, knowing his son hadn't measured up. Master Sergeant Frank Holloway watched from the range control tower, 52 years old, with salt and pepper hair, and the weathered face of a man who'd spent 3 decades in the desert sun. Former scout sniper himself, Desert Storm vintage, he'd made shots in Iraq that other Marines still whispered about in the scout sniper schoolhouse. Now he ran Whiskey Ridge Range, training the next generation, watching young warriors struggle with challenges he'd never faced. Technology had changed everything. In his day, they'd use Kentucky windage and estimated range with the mil-dot reticles in their scopes. Now these kids had laser rangefinders accurate to the meter ballistic computers that could calculate trajectory faster than God weather stations that measured atmospheric conditions down to the molecular level. Yet somehow they were missing shots he'd made with a compass and a prayer. Gunny Holloway's voice crackled across the radio net. Your equipment checks are all green. I'm showing valid data across all systems. The problem isn't technical. Garrett spun toward the tower, his voice raw. Then what the hell is the problem, Master Sergeant? These are the best Marines I've ever trained. This equipment is the finest technology the United States military has ever fielded. We have perfect environmental data. So why can't we hit that goddamn target? The words hung in the thin mountain air like an accusation against physics itself. That's when she appeared. At first, none of them noticed her. She was just part of the landscape, another piece of the base infrastructure that military minds had been trained to ignore. Sierra Services, Inc. contractor badge clipped to her faded khaki uniform shirt. Name patch reading simply E. Blackwood in block letters. Canvas work pants worn soft from countless washings. Steel-toed boots, scuffed and dusty. A ball cap pulled low over blonde hair, tied back in a practical ponytail. She moved along the range perimeter with a large black trash bag, emptying the waste receptacles placed every 50 yards along the safety barrier. Slow, methodical work. The kind of invisible labor that kept military bases functioning while warriors focused on the important business of preparing for war. Elaine Blackwood. Laney to friends she no longer had. 38 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, maybe 135 pounds. The kind of woman you'd pass on a base and never see, never remember, never think twice about. Which was exactly the point. She'd been at Whiskey Ridge for 18 months now, part of the civilian contractor workforce that handled grounds maintenance, custodial services, and all the unglamorous support work that the Marine Corps had long ago outsourced to save money. She showed up at 0600 every morning, drove her battered Ford F-150 to whatever range or training area needed attention, and disappeared at 15:30 when her shift ended. In 18 months, she'd spoken perhaps 1,000 words total to actual Marines. Most of those had been "excuse me" or "pardon me, sir," when she needed to work around training operations. But she watched. God, how she watched. Every movement along the range perimeter was calculated to give her sight lines to the firing positions. Every trash receptacle she emptied put her in position to observe wind flags, to study grass patterns, to read the thermal shimmer rising off sun-heated rocks and the movement of dust devils dancing across the valley floor. She saw things the Marines didn't see, things their expensive equipment couldn't measure. And right now, she saw 4 good warriors about to fail for all the wrong reasons. Laney finished emptying a trash barrel near the 800-yard marker, but she didn't move on to the next one. Instead, she stood there, eyes tracking uprange toward the firing line, then downrange toward the targets, then across the valley to where the morning sun was heating the dark granite ridge line. Her lips moved silently, calculating angles and temperatures and the invisible architecture of moving air that turned long-range shooting from science into art. Garrett was screaming again. "One more time. Caldwell, you're up. Same firing solution, same everything. Maybe we'll get lucky, and the wind will actually match what the computer says." Caldwell chambered another round, the bolt of the Barrett sliding home with the mechanical certainty of precision engineering. 50 caliber, 750 grains of copper-jacketed lead riding a charge of powder that generated 15,000 pounds of pressure. A bullet that could punch through engine blocks, that could reach out past 2,000 yards to touch targets the size of dinner plates. A bullet that kept missing a 4-foot steel plate at 1,700 yards. He settled into the scope, controlled his breathing, found his natural respiratory pause. The crosshairs steadied on the target. Wind hold 2.3 minutes left. Elevation confirmed. Everything perfect. The rifle fired. The massive muzzle brake channeled blast sideways, but even so, the recoil pushed Caldwell back against his rear sandbag. The report echoed across the valley. Through her spotting scope, Brennan tracked the bullet impact. Miss. 4 minutes right. Same as before. Garrett's self-control finally shattered completely. He kicked a folding chair 20 feet across the concrete shooting platform. "That's it. We're done finished. 2nd Battalion can have this deployment. Maybe not Gunny." The voice was quiet female with a soft drawl that might have been Texas, or might have been Oklahoma, or might have been any of a dozen places where people still said sir and ma'am without irony. 4 Marines and 1 range master turned as one toward the woman standing at the safety barrier trash bag, in one hand, the other hand raised in a gesture that was somehow both apologetic and absolutely confident. Garrett's face went from purple to crimson. "Excuse me, who the hell are—" "I'm real sorry to interrupt gunnery, Sergeant," Laney said, her voice still quiet but carrying clearly across the range. "But I've been watching your Marines shoot for the past hour, and I think I know what's wrong." The silence that followed was so complete that the distant call of a hawk echoed like thunder. Garrett found his voice first. It came out strangled, disbelieving. "You think you know what's wrong? You're a cleaning lady." Laney's expression didn't change. "Yes, sir, I am. But I've also been emptying trash on this range twice a week for 18 months, and I've learned a few things about how the wind moves through this valley." Brennan and Caldwell exchanged glances. Whitfield's jaw had literally dropped open. Holloway leaned forward in his tower, suddenly very interested. Garrett took 3 steps toward the barrier, using his 6'2" frame, the way he'd been trained to use it as a tool of intimidation. He loomed over Laney's 5'6", his body language aggressive, his voice dropping into the register that had made junior Marines snap to attention for 15 years. "Ma'am, this is a restricted military training area. I don't know who gave you clearance to be on this range during live fire operations, but your job is to empty trash cans, not to provide tactical advice to United States Marines." Laney held her ground, didn't step back, didn't look away, didn't show any of the fear or deference that Garrett's posture demanded. Her green eyes met his without flinching. "With respect, Gunnery Sergeant, my job is to keep this range clean and functional. Right now, I'm watching 4 good Marines fail because they're trusting equipment that can't see what I can see from where I'm standing." "And what exactly can you see?" Garrett's voice dripped with contempt. "Thermal inversion, sir." The words dropped into the conversation like grenades. Brennan's head snapped around. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. Even Whitfield straightened from his slouch against the ammunition crates. "Thermal inversion. A meteorological phenomenon where hot air trapped beneath cooler air creates invisible layers that bend light, that create mirage, that change how wind flows across terrain. Advanced concepts that showed up in military meteorology courses and ballistics handbooks. Technical terminology that had no business coming out of a cleaning contractor's mouth." Garrett's anger flickered, replaced momentarily by confusion. "What did you just say?" Laney pointed toward the valley. "Your wind flags are showing you surface winds, sir. Northwest at 15 miles per hour, just like your equipment says. But if you look at the grass on that ridgeline at about 900 yards, she paused, making sure they were tracking with her, "you'll see it's bending the opposite direction." Holloway grabbed binoculars, focusing on the spot she'd indicated. "Holy hell, she's right. The grass is bending southeast. That's because the hot air rising off those dark granite rocks is creating a rolling thermal current that reverses wind direction at mid-altitude." Laney continued, her voice still quiet but now carrying the unmistakable cadence of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. "Your bullets are flying through that layer at about the 950 to 1200 yard point. The computer can't see it because it only measures surface conditions. But the mountain is showing you the truth if you know how to read it." Caldwell lowered his rifle, actually studying the terrain now instead of his equipment. "The thermal layer, it's flowing opposite to the surface wind." "Yes, sir, and it's cycling. About every 45 to 50 seconds, the hot air completes its rotation, and you get a brief window, maybe 3-4 seconds, where the layers align and the wind is consistent from your position to the target." Brennan was furiously making notes. "How can you tell when the cycle completes?" Laney's slight smile was patient, like a teacher watching a student start to understand. "Watch the mirage pattern at about 1,000 yards. See how it pulses. That's your countdown timer. When it pulses, the thermal is resetting. Count to 5 after the pulse, and that's your window." The Marines stared at her, then at each other, then at the valley floor where, if they looked carefully with their training, suddenly focused on what she described, they could see exactly what she was talking about. The grass bending opposite to the wind flags. The way heat shimmer seemed to pulse in regular intervals. The dust devils that appeared and disappeared in a rhythm that matched her description perfectly. Environmental factors their $8,000 weather meter couldn't measure. Conditions their ballistic computers couldn't calculate. Truth that existed in the physical world rather than the digital one. Truth that this woman in a cleaning contractor uniform had seen while 4 elite Marines had been blind. Garrett's world was shifting beneath his feet. His voice came out quieter now, but harder. Ma'am, I've been shooting targets since before you learned to walk. I've made kills in Fallujah and Ramadi, in places I can't talk about. Don't tell me how to read wind. I'm not telling you how to read wind, Gundry Sergeant. Laney's voice remained calm, but something in her eyes had changed. Something cold had moved behind the green, something that recognized confrontation and had long ago stopped being afraid of it. I'm telling you that those Marines deserve better than dying in Syria because you're too proud to listen to someone in a maintenance uniform. The words hit like body blows. Brennan drew in a sharp breath. Caldwell's hand tightened on his rifle. Whitfield took an involuntary step backward. Garrett's face went white, then red, then white again. His fists clenched. For a long moment, everyone present thought he might actually strike her. Instead, his voice went deadly quiet. Get off my range. Laney held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then she nodded slowly once. Yes, sir. She turned to leave trash bag rustling. Wait. Holloway's voice crackled across the radio net, then echoed from the tower loudspeaker. Ma'am, hold position, please. Laney stopped, turned back. The rangemaster emerged from his tower, moving with the deliberate purpose of a man who just made a decision that would probably end up in an official report. He crossed the 50 yards between his station and the firing line, his eyes moving between Laney, the frustrated Marines, and the valley floor that suddenly looked very different now that someone had pointed out what to look for. Ma'am, Holloway said carefully, you seem to know a considerable amount about long-range ballistics. I've picked up a few things over the years, Master Sergeant. Where exactly did you pick them up? Laney's expression was neutral, almost carefully so. Books mostly. I've always been interested in precision shooting. It's a fascinating science. Science, Holloway repeated. He studied her for a long moment. Something about her posture had registered in his hindbrain, something familiar that he couldn't quite place. Ma'am, forgive me for asking, but what's your background before you worked maintenance? I've had a few different, moved around quite a bit. It was a non-answer delivered with the kind of pleasant vagueness that said absolutely nothing while sounding completely cooperative. The kind of response that trained interrogators recognized as deflection. Garrett had recovered some of his composure. Master Sergeant, with all due respect, we don't need input from civilian contractors. We need to complete our qualification. Actually, Gunny, Brennan said quietly, still studying the valley floor through her spotting scope. I think she might be right about the thermal layer. I can see the pattern she described. The mirage definitely pulses every 45 seconds or so. Caldwell nodded slowly. And if there's a mid-altitude wind reversal, that would explain why our computer-calculated hold is giving us consistent misses in the same direction. Whitfield had moved to the barrier, looking downrange with new eyes. Master Sergeant Holloway permission to test the theory. Before Holloway could respond, Laney spoke again. Her voice was different now, not quite as soft, carrying more authority. With respect, Sergeant, testing the theory means waiting 45 seconds between shots and timing your trigger pull to a 3-second window. You'll burn through your remaining ammunition, learning the cycle rhythm. Then how would you suggest we proceed, ma'am? Brennan's tone was respectful, genuinely curious. Laney was quiet for a moment, and something played across her features that might have been resignation or might have been relief. When she spoke, her voice was steady. What if I showed you I could hit all 3 targets with a single shot? The words hung in the desert air like heat shimmer. 3 targets. The primary qualification target at 1,700 yards, the auxiliary target at 2,000 yards, the extreme range marker at 2,200 yards. All 3 set up in a rough line down the valley floor, positioned for different training exercises. Hit all 3 with 1 bullet. Garrett laughed. It was a harsh sound without humor. Ma'am, that's not just difficult. That's physically impossible. You're talking about ricochet ballistics on a moving round at distances where wind drift alone? It's possible if you understand the angles in the target materials, Laney interrupted quietly, and if you can read the thermal cycles I described. 1 shot, proper placement, the bullet deflects at calculated angles off the first 2 targets and carries through to the 3rd. Holloway's expression had gone very still. Ma'am, what you're describing is a theoretical technique that's taught in exactly 1 military course that I'm aware of. Advanced Precision Fire, run by Special Operations Command. How exactly do you know about ricochet ballistics? I read a lot, Master Sergeant. Another non-answer. Garrett's laugh had died. He was staring at this woman in her faded contractor uniform, trying to reconcile what she was saying with what she appeared to be. You're seriously claiming you can make that shot? I'm offering to demonstrate the thermal cycle theory. If I miss, I apologize for wasting your time and I'll get back to my maintenance work. If I hit, Laney paused, meeting Garrett's eyes. Maybe you'll consider that there might be something to environmental reading beyond what your computers can measure. Caldwell found his voice. Ma'am, the 1,700-yard target is at the edge of most hunting rifle capabilities. 2,000 yards is definitely beyond standard civilian equipment. 2,200 yards is... He trailed off, shaking his head. That's military precision rifle territory. Most hunting rifles, you're right, Laney agreed. But I've got a Remington 700 in my truck that's been modified a bit. Built it myself over a couple of years. It shoots sub-minute of angle groups at 1,000 yards if I do my part. Brennan's eyes narrowed. You built a custom precision rifle. Yes, ma'am. What kind of modifications are we talking about? Krieger barrel match chamber Macmillan A5 stock, dual trigger Night Force attacker scope. Nothing fancy, just solid components properly assembled and properly tuned. The Marines exchanged glances. Those weren't hobbyist components. That was a build list that belonged to competitive precision shooters or professional marksmen. Equipment that cost more than many people earned in months. Expertise that took years to develop. Holloway made a decision. Ma'am, Marine Corps regulations technically don't prohibit civilian demonstrations of marksmanship skills, provided all safety protocols are followed. If you can provide proof of weapon registration and accept full liability, I'm willing to allow this demonstration. Garrett started to object. Master Sergeant, Gunny, with respect, we're out of options and almost out of time. If this works, your Marines learn something. If it doesn't, we've lost 10 minutes. Either way, I want to see what happens when someone with her confidence level backs it up with action. Laney nodded. I'll get my rifle. Give me 5 minutes. She walked toward the contractor parking area trash bag forgotten by the barrier. 4 Marines watched her go. This is insane, Garrett muttered. We're taking shooting advice from a cleaning lady. A cleaning lady who just used thermal inversion and ricochet ballistics in casual conversation, Brennan pointed out. Whitfield had his phone out already, pulling up base security protocols. Master Sergeant, I'm going to run her contractor badge through the system. Something about this feels off. Good instinct, Sergeant, Holloway replied. He pulled out his own phone, dialing base security. This is Range Master Holloway at Whiskey Ridge. I need a clearance verification on contractor badge number. He squinted at Laney's retreating back, reading the badge number through his binoculars. Sierra 7113, name Blackwood E. The response came back 40 seconds later. Holloway's expression changed as he listened. His eyebrows rose. He asked for repeat confirmation. Then he ended the call and stood there for a long moment, phone still in hand, staring at nothing. Master Sergeant, Garrett prompted. The security officer says that badge number is classified. He literally said clearance classified, do not pursue, refer any questions to Colonel Thatcher. Silence, boom. That's not a normal contractor response, Caldwell said quietly. No, it is not. Across the parking area, Laney had reached a dusty Ford F-150 with contractor plates. She lowered the tailgate and pulled out a long black case. Even from 200 yards away, through spotting scopes and binoculars, the Marines could see it wasn't a standard rifle case. It was a Pelican Storm case, the kind of ruggedized transport container that professionals use for equipment that couldn't be allowed to fail. She carried it back toward the firing line with practiced ease, moving with the kind of efficiency that spoke of muscle memory and thousands of repetitions. When she reached the barrier, she set the case down on a shooting bench and popped the latches. The lid opened to reveal custom foam cutouts precisely fitted to the weapon and accessories inside. Holloway leaned over to inspect it. What he saw made his breath catch. The rifle was indeed built on a Remington 700 action, but calling it a hunting rifle was like calling a Formula One car a sedan. Every component was premium grade. The Krieger barrel was heavy match profile 26 inches of precision crafted steel. The Macmillan stock was carbon fiber with aluminum bedding block. The Night Force scope was one of the most expensive pieces of glass you could mount on a rifle. But it was the small details that caught Holloway's trained eye. The trigger guard was slightly modified. The bolt handle had been replaced with a tactical model. The barrel threading was military spec. There were witness marks on the scope rings that suggested the weapon had been zeroed and re-zeroed dozens of times, maybe hundreds. This wasn't a rifle someone bought. This was a rifle someone built with deep knowledge and deeper purpose. "May I?" Holloway asked, gesturing to the weapon. "Of course, Master Sergeant." He lifted it from the case. The balance was perfect. The weight was exactly what military precision rifles weighted. He worked the bolt butter smooth, precisely timed. The trigger broke at exactly 2 pounds, crisp as glass. Someone who knew what they were doing had built this rifle, not someone who'd read books. Someone who'd built enough precision rifles to know exactly what they wanted. "Ma'am, this is exceptional work," Holloway said quietly. "Thank you, Master Sergeant." Garrett was still skeptical, but his confidence was wavering. "You said you built this yourself?" "Yes, sir. Took about 2 years to get everything exactly right. Tested at the range every weekend until I had the load development perfected." "What cartridge?" .308 Winchester. Hand loads with Sierra 175 grain Match King bullets. Federal brass CCI primers, 43.5 grains of Varget powder. Not as flat shooting as your 50 cal Corporal Caldwell, but plenty accurate for this distance, if I read the wind correctly. She was rattling off specifications like reading a recipe. Brennan pulled out her notebook and was actually writing them down. Laney lifted the rifle, performed a press check to verify it was unloaded, then executed a function check that was textbook perfect. Chamber check, bolt, operation, trigger, function, safety operation. The sequence took 15 seconds and was performed with the unconscious competence of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Caldwell noticed. "Ma'am, where did you learn rifle function checks?" "Safety courses," Laney replied, which was technically true and also revealed nothing. She loaded 5 rounds into the internal magazine, worked 1 into the chamber, engaged the safety. Then she moved to the firing position and began setting up with an economy of motion that made all 4 Marines stop and watch. Her movements were absolutely precise. No wasted effort, no hesitation. Rear sandbag positioned, front sandbag adjusted, rifle settled into the cradle, body alignment perfect, left leg cocked at 90 degrees, right leg straight behind, elbows positioned for bone support rather than muscle tension. It was the shooting position taught in the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School. Refined and perfected, Garrett and Holloway locked eyes. Neither spoke, but the same thought passed between them. That's not a civilian shooting stance. Laney settled in behind the scope, her body going still, in the way that shooters learn over years of practice. Her breathing slowed, deepened, became rhythmic. Her right hand found the perfect grip on the stock. Her left hand adjusted slightly for elevation control. For 90 seconds, she didn't move. Just watched through the scope, her eyes tracking invisible patterns in the air. Finally, she spoke. "Surface wind, 14 miles per hour northwest, just like your equipment says. Mid-level crosswind, approximately 7 miles per hour southwest, the reversal I mentioned. High altitude flow, minimal, maybe 2 miles per hour. Thermal inversion completing cycle at 950 yards, creating the rolling current." Her voice had changed, not louder, but more authoritative. The soft drawl was still there, but beneath it was something else. Command presence. The voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Mirage pulse in 45 seconds, she continued. "Watch for it. When you see the shimmer intensify at about 1,000 yards, that's the thermal resetting. 5-second count after that, and the layers align for a 3-second window." Brennan had her spotting scope up, focused where Laney had indicated. "I see the mirage. It's definitely pulsing." "Jesus, she's right. It pulses every 45 seconds like clockwork." 30 seconds. Laney announced, her voice quieter now, falling into the meditative calm that long-range shooters cultivate. 20, 15. Her breathing had slowed even further. 4 breaths per minute now, maybe less. The kind of respiratory control that took years of training to master. 10 seconds. 5. The Marines held their collective breath. Window opening. Firing. The rifle fired. The suppressor she'd installed channeled most of the blast forward, but even so the report cracked across the valley and echoed off the granite walls. Through binoculars, through spotting scopes, through the magnified optics of their Barrett rifle scope, 4 Marines and 1 rangemaster watched the bullet's flight. At 1,700 yards, the primary qualification target, a 4-foot steel plate sang out with a distinctive clang of a solid center mass hit. But the bullet didn't stop. Instead of flattening against the steel, the copper-jacketed round hit at exactly the angle Laney had calculated. The combination of bullet velocity, target, material hardness, and geometric precision created a ricochet that sent the bullet screaming toward the second target at a 23-degree deflection. At 2,000 yards, the auxiliary target, a 3-foot plate, rang like a church bell. Clang! The bullet deflected again, now tumbling slightly, but carrying enough retained energy and the exact trajectory needed to reach the final target. At 2,200 yards, the extreme range marker, a 2-foot plate barely visible, even through optics, exploded with impact. Clang! The echoes faded across the valley. The wind still blew. The heat shimmer still danced. The mountains still breathed its invisible currents. But everything had changed. Laney worked the bolt, ejected the spent brass, caught it, and engaged the safety. She sat up from the rifle, her movements still controlled and precise, and turned to face the Marines who were staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something approaching awe. "That's wind-reading gunnery, Sergeant," she said quietly. "When you understand the environment, you can work with it instead of fighting against it." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They just stared at the 3 distant targets that had each sung out in sequence, and at the woman in the cleaning contractor uniform who'd just done something that shouldn't have been possible. Garrett found his voice first. It came out hoarse. That shot was impossible," Caldwell finished. "That shot was impossible." "No, Corporal," Holloway said slowly, lowering his binoculars. "That shot was precisely calculated and perfectly executed by someone with extraordinary skill." He turned to look at Laney, really look at her now, seeing past the contractor uniform to the woman beneath, taking in details he'd missed before. The way she held herself, the unconscious military bearing, the faded line on her left ring finger, where a wedding band had once been worn for years before being removed, the tiny scars on her hands that looked like the kind of scarring soldiers develop from weapons maintenance and field operations. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I think we need to continue this conversation. Would you mind if I asked to see some identification?" For just a moment, less than a heartbeat, something flickered across Laney's features. Not fear, not even concern, just calculation. The look of someone suddenly realizing that a game had changed in ways that couldn't be unchanged. Then she smiled, a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, Master Sergeant." She reached into her pocket and produced her contractor identification badge. "Sierra Services, Inc. Name E. Blackwood. Security clearance level confidential. Badge number SS71113. Employment date 18 months prior." Everything looked perfectly legitimate, completely normal, except for the security response that had come back classified when Holloway had run her badge number 5 minutes earlier. Before anyone could speak, a new sound entered the valley, distant at first, then growing rapidly louder. The distinctive whop, whop, whop of helicopter rotors, heavy and fast, the sound of serious machinery moving with serious purpose. All heads turned toward the sound. Over the eastern ridge, flying low and fast in a tactical approach profile that military helicopters used when they didn't want to give potential enemies time to prepare, came a UH-60 Blackhawk. Not a training bird, a command bird with extra communications equipment visible even from a distance. The radio in Holloway's vest crackled to life. "Whiskey Ridge Range Control, this is Sabre 6 actual emergency priority flight inbound with Colonel Thatcher and Defense Intelligence Agency representatives. Clear all firing lines immediately and prepare for command consultation. Acknowledge." Holloway keyed his mic, his eyes still on the approaching helicopter. "Sabre 6 actual Whiskey Ridge Range Control acknowledges. Firing line is cold range is clear, ready for your arrival. Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. The organization that handled military intelligence operations, that ran deep cover agents in foreign countries, that conducted classified assessments of everything from enemy capabilities to the loyalty of allied governments. The organization that apparently had something to do with E. Blackwood, cleaning contractor. The Black Hawk flared over the landing zone, rotors beating the air into submission, kicking up a massive dust cloud that forced everyone to turn away and shield their eyes. It touched down hard, the way military pilots landed, when urgency mattered more than comfort. Before the rotors had even begun to spool down, the side door slammed open and figures emerged through the dust cloud. First came Colonel Robert Thatcher, base commander, 56 years old, former Force Recon himself, a man who'd earned his eagles the hard way, through 28 years of leading Marines into places where failure meant body bags. Behind him came Sergeant Major Douglas Pemberton, the senior enlisted Marine on base, a British-American bull of a man who'd served from Gulf War through Afghanistan. And behind them came two people in civilian clothes who moved with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents who didn't much care about military rank. They walked directly toward the firing line, directly toward Laney. Garrett's team snapped to attention. Holloway rendered a salute. Laney stood very still, her expression neutral, her hands loose at her sides. Colonel Thatcher stopped 10 feet away. His expression was grim, frustrated, and somehow also resigned. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of command and the weight of classified knowledge. "Sergeant Major Blackwood," he said, "we need to talk, now." The world stopped. Sergeant Major, not ma'am, not contractor. Sergeant Major. Four Force Recon Marines stood frozen, their minds trying to process what they'd just heard. Holloway's eyes had gone wide. Even the two federal agents looked slightly uncomfortable. And Laney, the woman they'd known as a cleaning contractor for 18 months, just stood there with that same small, tired smile. "Yes, sir. Sir," she said quietly, her voice still carrying that soft drawl, but now laced with something else. Recognition, acceptance, relief maybe that the game was finally over. "Colonel, I assume my cover is completely blown?" "Completely," Thatcher confirmed. Laney nodded slowly, then turned to look at the four Marines who were staring at her with expressions of absolute shock. "Gentlemen," she said, "I think you're about to get some answers to questions you probably wish you'd never thought to ask." The helicopter's rotors continued to slow behind them. The mountain wind still blew its invisible currents through the valley. The three distant targets still bore fresh bullet impacts that proved something impossible had just happened. And somewhere in the gap between what had been believed and what was now known, the story of Sergeant Major Elaine Blackwood, legendary Marine decorated warrior, and for 18 months the most unlikely janitor in Marine Corps history, was about to be told. The dust from the Black Hawk's rotor wash still hung in the thin mountain air, like a living thing swirling around the boots of men and women who suddenly found themselves standing at the intersection of military protocol and something far more complicated. Colonel Thatcher's weathered face showed the kind of exhaustion that came from dealing with situations that existed in the gray spaces between classified operations and catastrophic exposure. Behind him, Agent Mackenzie Sterling stepped forward, her strawberry blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, her civilian clothes, dark suit, practical shoes, doing nothing to hide the fact that she was federal law enforcement of the most serious kind. Defense Intelligence Agency. The people who handled operations that even the CIA didn't want to touch. Her eyes swept across the assembled Marines with the clinical assessment of someone trained to evaluate threats and calculate risks in milliseconds. "Gunnery Sergeant Garrett," Thatcher said, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions made in circumstances that would never appear in any official report. "Stand your team at ease. What I'm about to tell you is classified secret. What you've witnessed today is now part of an ongoing intelligence operation that has just been severely compromised." Garrett's world had been tilting sideways for the past 10 minutes. Now it seemed to be in full freefall. "Sir, I don't understand. This woman is a civilian contractor. She's been emptying trash cans on this range for 18 months, Thatcher interrupted. "Yes, Gunny, I'm aware. I'm the one who authorized her presence here." The words hung in the desert air like an accusation. Sergeant Major Pemberton moved to stand beside Laney, his massive frame making her look even smaller in her faded contractor uniform. When he spoke, his voice carried the gravel of 3 decades of service and the careful diction of a man who'd been born in Liverpool before becoming more American than most native citizens. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce Sergeant Major Elaine Blackwood, United States Marine Corps retired. Former Chief Scout Sniper Instructor at Marine Corps Base Quantico from 2008 through 2015. author of Fleet Marine Force Reference Publication 3-231, which I believe is the manual gunnery Sergeant Garrett uses to teach advanced marksmanship. Brennan's spotting scope slipped from her fingers and clattered against the concrete shooting platform. Caldwell's mouth had fallen open. Whitfield took an involuntary step backward, as if distance might somehow make the information less impossible to process. Holloway felt something click into place in his memory. Sergeant Major Blackwood, he repeated slowly. The Blackwood, the one who developed environmental ballistics methodology in '09. The one who, he trailed off, his face going pale as more pieces connected. The one from Kunar province. Laney's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes went very still. Yes, Master Sergeant, that's me. Agent Sterling pulled out a tablet, tapped it to life, and began reading from what was clearly an official military record. Her voice was flat, clinical, the tone of someone delivering information that carried too much weight to be colored by emotion. Sergeant Major Elaine Blackwood, service number 0341862, enlisted United States Marine Corps, April 2003, age 17 with parental consent. Graduated recruit training as platoon honor graduate. Military occupational specialty, 0317 Scout Sniper. First combat deployment, Iraq Ramadi 2005 through '06. Second deployment, Afghanistan, Helmand Province, 2010. Achieved rank of gunnery sergeant by 2008. Promoted to sergeant major in 2011. Assigned as Chief Scout Sniper Instructor, Quantico, 2012 through 2015. She paused, looking up from the tablet. During her tenure as Chief Instructor, Sergeant Major Blackwood personally trained over 600 Marine Scout snipers. Her students include 2 Medal of Honor recipients, 14 Navy Cross recipients, and 47 Silver Star recipients for actions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and classified locations. In 2009, she developed what's now known as the Blackwood Method of Environmental Ballistics, a system of wind reading and atmospheric assessment that's credited with increasing long-range engagement success rates by 43%. Garrett felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Every technique he'd learned, every method he taught, every principle he'd built his instructor career on, it had all come from this woman. This woman he'd screamed at. This woman he'd treated like dirt. Sterling continued reading. Awards include the Navy Cross for classified action in Afghanistan, 2010. 2 Silver Stars with Combat 5, Bronze Star with Combat 5, Purple Heart with 2 Oak Leaf Clusters, Combat Action Ribbon, Presidential Unit Citation, 3 combat deployments totaling 38 months in hostile fire zones. The words kept coming, each one landing like hammer blows. 3rd and final combat deployment, Afghanistan, Kunar Province, 2012. Operation Granite Shield. Sergeant Major Blackwood commanded an 8 Marine Scout sniper team conducting reconnaissance and target interdiction along the Pakistan border. Sterling's voice finally showed emotion. It was carefully controlled, but it was there a hint of something that might have been grief or might have been respect for what was coming next. September 15, 2012, Blackwood's team was ambushed by an estimated 40 to 50 Taliban fighters in a mountain valley approximately 20 miles from the Pakistani border. The engagement lasted 11 hours. All 8 Marines under Sergeant Major Blackwood's command were killed in action. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause. Sergeant Major Blackwood was the sole survivor, Sterling continued quietly. She maintained her position and continued engaging enemy forces for 11 hours until weather cleared sufficiently for helicopter extraction. Post-action assessment determined she had killed 27 enemy fighters. 3 of those kills were made after she sustained wounds that should have rendered her combat ineffective. She refused medical evacuation until all casualties, both friendly and enemy, had been accounted for and all classified equipment had been secured. Laney was staring at something in the middle distance, her expression completely neutral, but her right hand had moved unconsciously to touch something under her uniform shirt. The outline of dog tags was visible through the fabric. Brennan had tears running down her face. Caldwell looked physically sick. Whitfield was shaking his head, slowly unable to process what he was hearing. The Marine Corps offered Sergeant Major Blackwood the Medal of Honor for her actions that day, Sterling said. She refused it. She requested immediate discharge instead. The Corps tried to convince her to remain, offered psychological counseling, offered reassignment, offered everything they could think of to keep one of their most valuable training assets. I told them no, Lainey said quietly, her first words since Thatcher had called her by rank. I told them I couldn't teach anymore, couldn't send more young Marines to die the way mine did. Garrett found his voice, though it came out hoarse and broken. Ma'am, those Marines, what happened? Lainey was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but carried an undertone of something that might have been infinite weariness. I misread the terrain, Gunnery Sergeant. Didn't properly assess the valley approach routes. Didn't identify all the enemy hide positions. Put my team in a geographic choke point that became a kill zone. That's not what the after-action report concluded, Pemberton interjected. The investigation determined that intelligence was faulty, that enemy strength was underestimated by at least 3 to 1, and that the team performed above and beyond under impossible circumstances. The report was wrong, Lainey said flatly. I was the team leader. They died. I didn't. That's on me. The naked pain in those words made everyone present look away. There were some wounds that rank and time couldn't heal, some failures, real or imagined, that carved themselves into a warrior's soul and never let go. Thatcher stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. Sergeant Major, what happened in Kunar was not your fault, but I understand why you needed to step away, which is why when the Defense Intelligence Agency approached me 18 months ago about a unique opportunity, I immediately thought of you. Agent Sterling took over the briefing. The DIA became aware of a concerning pattern in Marine Corps sniper training programs. Combat after-action reports from Syria, Afghanistan, and classified locations showed an increasing failure rate in long-range engagements. Success rates that should have been in the 85 to 90% range were dropping to 60% or lower. Marines who'd qualified at the top of their class were missing shots in combat that should have been routine. She pulled up data on her tablet showing graphs and statistics that painted a disturbing picture. Analysis suggested the problem wasn't individual Marine capability. It was institutional methodology. Training programs had become over-reliant on technology, ballistic computers, weather stations, laser rangefinders. Young snipers were learning to trust their equipment more than their own assessment of environmental conditions. Holloway was nodding slowly. I've seen it. Marines who can give you ballistic solutions to 3 decimal places, but can't tell you which way the grass is bending. Exactly, Sterling confirmed. Technology is valuable, but it's also fallible. Weather stations measure conditions at specific points, not the 3-dimensional atmospheric complexity that bullets actually fly through. Ballistic computers can't account for thermal inversions, for terrain-induced wind patterns, for the microenvironments that exist in mountain valleys and urban canyons. We needed someone who could assess Marine sniper training programs, Thatcher continued. Someone with the expertise to identify problems and the credibility to propose solutions. But we couldn't send an inspector general. We couldn't send an official evaluator. Marines would modify their behavior if they knew they were being watched. So you sent a ghost, Garrett said quietly, understanding dawning. Someone who could observe without affecting what they were observing. We approached Sergeant Major Blackwood, Thatcher confirmed, asked if she'd be willing to go undercover as a civilian contractor at multiple Marine bases, watch training operations, identify instructors whose methods were producing Marines who couldn't adapt to real-world conditions. Lainey finally spoke again. I told them no at first. Told them I was done with the Marine Corps, done with training, done with sending young warriors into situations where they might die. What changed your mind? Brennan asked softly. Lainey looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time her carefully neutral expression cracked slightly. I got sent a casualty report from Syria, a Marine Scout sniper team that got pinned down by enemy fire. Lost 3 Marines because they couldn't locate the enemy sniper. The after-action report said they had perfect equipment, perfect data, perfect everything, but they couldn't read the environment, couldn't see what their computers couldn't measure. She paused, her jaw tightening. The team leader's name was on the report, Lance Corporal Michael Brennan, someone I trained at Quantico in 2013. Natalie Brennan went absolutely still. Michael Brennan was my brother. The words fell like stones into deep water. I know, Laney said quietly. I recognized you the first time I saw you on this range. You have his eyes, his shooting stance. When I read that casualty report and saw his name, I realized something. I couldn't hide from teaching, because if I did more, Marines would die the way my team died, the way your brother died. Tears were streaming freely down Brennan's face now. He talked about you. In his emails home, said you were the best instructor he'd ever had. Said you taught him to see what was real instead of what the computer said. Then I failed him, Laney replied, her voice rough, because he died anyway. He died because the Marine who replaced you as chief instructor didn't teach environmental reading. Sterling interjected, pulling up more files on her tablet. After you left in 2015, the Scout Sniper School shifted to a more technology-focused curriculum. Ballistic computers became the primary tool. Environmental assessment became secondary. Your methods were considered legacy techniques, valuable but outdated. She turned the tablet around, showing casualty statistics that were stark and damning. Sniper-related combat casualties increased 37% after your methodology was phased out. That's what convinced Sergeant Major Blackwood to accept the undercover assignment. 18 months ago, Thatcher continued, we established the Sierra Services contractor position, gave Sergeant Major Blackwood the cover identity of a maintenance worker. She's assessed 6 Marine bases in that time. Whiskey Ridge was number 7. Garrett felt his career crumbling around him like sandcastles in high tide. How many instructors has she identified as problems? 23, Sterling said flatly. 23 instructors whose training methods were producing Marines who couldn't adapt to real-world conditions. Instructors who emphasized equipment over environmental assessment. Who punished mistakes instead of teaching adaptability. Who created Marines that were perfect on the range and ineffective in combat. She looked directly at Garrett. You were under review, Gunnery Sergeant. Sergeant Major Blackwood's preliminary reports suggested your methods fell into the problematic category. The words hit like physical blows. Garrett's vision tunneled. His hands were shaking. 15 years of service. 15 years of believing he was making Marines better, stronger, more capable. And it had all been wrong, worse than wrong, dangerous. Sir, He started, then stopped because there were no words, no excuse, no defense. Laney stepped forward, moving with that same controlled precision she'd shown throughout. Colonel, permission to speak freely. Granted. She turned to face Garrett directly, and when she spoke, her voice carried authority that couldn't be hidden anymore. Gunnery Sergeant Garrett isn't a bad instructor. He's a scared one. Garrett's head snapped up. Ma'am, you lost 3 Marines in Fallujah, Laney continued. I read the after-action report. Vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, bad intelligence about enemy positions in the sector. You were their squad leader. You blame yourself. Garrett's throat had gone tight. How did she know that? How could she possibly? I know, Laney said as if reading his mind. Because I've seen that look in the mirror every day for 12 years. That look that says you're terrified of losing more people, so you overcompensate. You make training harder than it needs to be. You demand perfection instead of teaching adaptability. You rely on equipment because if the technology fails, it's not your fault. She moved closer, her green eyes locked on his. But here's what you forgot, Wade. What you're actually protecting. It's not your career. It's not your pride. It's their lives, those Marines behind you. They don't need a perfect instructor who never makes mistakes. They need one who teaches them to think, to adapt, to read the truth of their environment instead of the comfort of their computers. I was trying to keep them safe, Garrett's voice cracked. I know. But safe Marines on the range become dead Marines in combat if they can't adapt when their equipment fails them. And equipment always fails. The battery dies. The computer glitches. The weather station gives bad data. When that happens, what do they have left? Their training, Garrett whispered. Their eyes, Laney corrected. Their brain. Their ability to read what's real. That's what I was trying to teach you this morning, not how to make impossible shots. How to see what's actually there instead of what your equipment tells you should be there. Caldwell spoke up, his voice thoughtful. The thermal inversion, the wind layers, the mirage patterns, those were all visible. We just weren't looking for them because we trusted our computers. Exactly, Laney confirmed. Technology is a tool, an important tool, but it's not a replacement for situational awareness and environmental assessment. Your ballistic computer gave you a firing solution based on surface wind data. It wasn't wrong, the surface wind was exactly what it measured, but you needed to look beyond the data to see the complete picture. Whitfield was studying Laney with new eyes. Ma'am, when you made that shot, the three targets with one bullet that wasn't showing off, was it? No, Sergeant. That was demonstrating that understanding your environment lets you do things that pure technology says are impossible. Ricochet ballistics isn't magic. It's mathematics combined with environmental reading. The computer can calculate the angle of incidence and the deflection coefficient. But only your eyes can tell you whether the thermal cycle is aligned correctly to keep the bullet stable through mid-flight turbulence. She gestured toward the distant targets. That shot required understanding wind layers, thermal patterns, target material properties, bullet construction, and timing. 5 variables that had to align perfectly. 4 of them I could measure with equipment. The 5th, the thermal cycle, I could only measure by watching the mountain breathe and learning its rhythm. Brennan had recovered enough to ask the question they were all thinking. Ma'am, why reveal yourself? If your mission was to observe, why intervene? You could have just filed your report and moved on to the next base. Laney was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision that couldn't be unmade. Because I watched 4 good Marines struggling with a problem I could solve. Because you're deploying to Syria in 48 hours. Because I've read the intelligence reports about enemy sniper activity in your operational area, and I know that if you go downrange with your current skill set, at least one of you won't come home. She looked at each of them in turn. I couldn't let that happen. Not again. Not when I knew I could help. But you compromised your mission. Sterling pointed out, her voice carrying professional frustration. 18 months of careful positioning burned in 10 minutes. Yes, ma'am, Laney acknowledged. I made that choice. These Marines' lives were worth more than my cover. Thatcher and Sterling exchanged glances. Some unspoken communication passed between them. Finally, Thatcher nodded. Which brings us to our current problem, he said. Sergeant Major Blackwood's demonstration was observed by parties other than Marine personnel. He gestured to Sterling, who pulled up satellite imagery on her tablet. Time-stamped 11:47 that morning, it showed Whiskey Ridge Range from high altitude. But more concerning were the 3 highlighted positions in the surrounding terrain hillsides overlooking the range from different angles. These are observation posts, Sterling explained. Foreign intelligence services have been attempting to identify and track retired U.S. Special Operations personnel for the past several years. We've been monitoring their surveillance operations, but we believe Sergeant Major Blackwood's cover was solid enough to avoid attention. She zoomed in on one of the positions. This morning's shot demonstration may have compromised that assessment. A 3-target ricochet hit at those distances is not something a civilian contractor should be capable of. It's the kind of shot that only appears in classified special operations training programs. How many watchers? Holloway asked, his operational instincts kicking in. At least 3 teams that we've identified, Sterling replied. Possibly Russian GRU, though we can't confirm. They've been surveilling this base for 6 weeks. We believe they're attempting to identify former U.S. military personnel for potential targeting or leverage operations. Garrett's anger had transformed into something else, protective instinct. Ma'am, are you saying those people might try to hurt Sergeant Major Blackwood? We're saying her safety situation has changed significantly, Thatcher confirmed, which is why we're here. Sergeant Major Blackwood needs to be extracted and relocated immediately. No, Laney said flatly. Thatcher's eyebrows rose. Excuse me. With respect, sir, no. These Marines deploy in 48 hours. They'll die with their current training. I need 24 hours to teach them properly. Your safety, Sterling began. I've spent 18 months hiding behind a mop and a trash bag. Laney interrupted, her voice hard now, showing the steel that it had kept her fighting for 11 hours in an Afghan valley. I'm done hiding. Give me 24 hours to train them. After that, you can extract me to wherever you want. But right now, these 4 Marines need what I can teach them. The risk, Thatcher started, is acceptable, Laney finished. Sir, I've read the intelligence reports about Syria. The mountains they'll be operating in have the same thermal characteristics as this valley, but more extreme. If they can't read wind layers here, they'll be blind there. and blind snipers are dead snipers. She turned to face the Force Recon team. I can teach you in 24 hours what it took me 10 years to learn. Not because you're slow, because I've refined the teaching process. The Blackwood method isn't complicated. It's just systematic environmental assessment combined with patient observation. But you need to practice it until it becomes instinctive. Caldwell spoke up. Sergeant Major, I'll say this respectfully. We've got maybe 6 hours of daylight left. Then we lose training time to darkness, sleep, and pre-deployment prep. How can we possibly learn advanced environmental ballistics in that time frame? Laney's smile was small and fierce. Because you're Force Recon Marines who've already proven you can master complex skills under pressure. Because I'm going to teach you the way I taught at Quantico, which is faster and more effective than the methods you've been using. And because failure isn't an option. She looked at Thatcher. Sir, permission to conduct emergency training package for deployment readiness. Thatcher studied her for a long moment. Behind him, the helicopter's rotors had finally stopped spinning. The mountain wind blew its constant patterns. The 3 distant targets still bore the fresh impacts of an impossible shot. Finally, he nodded. 24 hours, Sergeant Major. After that, extraction is non-negotiable. Understood, sir. Thatcher turned to Garrett. Gunnery Sergeant, you're relieved of active training, duties pending review. However, you will observe Sergeant Major Blackwood's instruction and document her methodology. Consider it an opportunity to learn from one of the best instructors the Marine Corps has ever produced. Garrett's relief was palpable. Not forgiveness, he didn't deserve that, but a chance to learn to understand where he'd gone wrong. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. Your performance review will include assessment of whether you can adapt these methods into your future instruction. If you can't demonstrate that capability, your instructor status will be permanently revoked. The threat hung in the air like a sword, but Garrett met Thatcher's eyes and nodded. Understood, sir. I'll learn it. Thatcher, Sterling, and Pemberton returned to the helicopter. Its turbines began spooling up again. Within minutes, the Black Hawk lifted off, banking hard to the east and disappearing over the ridgeline. Laney turned to face her students. The 4 Marines who'd spent 18 months walking past her without a second glance now stood at something close to attention, their entire perception of reality having shifted in the past 30 minutes. All right, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd trained hundreds of Marines and kept most of them alive. We've got 24 hours. Here's how we're going to use them. She moved to the shooting platform, pulling out a notebook from her rifle case. The pages were worn, filled with handwritten diagrams and notes accumulated over years. First principle of environmental ballistics. The mountain doesn't lie. Technology can malfunction. Data can be wrong. Computers can glitch. But physics is consistent. Air moves in predictable patterns based on temperature, terrain, and pressure. Learn to read those patterns, and you can make shots in conditions where equipment fails. She began sketching on a whiteboard someone had brought out from the range office. Her drawings were quick, precise, showing wind flow patterns around terrain features. Second principle, bullets fly through 3 dimensions. Surface wind matters, but so does mid-altitude flow and high-altitude jet stream. Most ballistic computers only account for surface conditions because that's what weather stations measure. You need to learn to see the complete vertical profile. Brennan was taking notes furiously. Caldwell had pulled out his phone to photograph the whiteboard. Whitfield was already asking questions about how to identify thermal inversions at different times of day. Even Garrett was writing in his own notebook, his earlier anger transformed into desperate focus. For the next 6 hours, as the sun tracked across the California sky and the shadows lengthened across Whiskey Ridge Range, Laney taught. Not the formal curriculum of Scout Sniper School, not the structured lessons designed for 12-week courses. This was combat training compressed and intense, focused on survival skills that might mean the difference between coming home alive and coming home in a flag-draped coffin. She taught them to read grass patterns at multiple distances simultaneously, to recognize mirage characteristics that indicated thermal layers, to time their shots to natural environmental cycles rather than forcing shots into unfavorable conditions, to trust their observations over their equipment when the two contradicted each other. She taught them to see what was real instead of what their computers said should be real. Around 1,700 hours, Caldwell finally made his first clean, hit on the 1,700-yard target using environmental reading alone. His ballistic computer turned off and stowed in his pack. He sat up from the rifle with tears in his eyes. "I saw it," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "I actually saw the thermal layer reset. Watched the Mirage pulse counted 5 seconds, fired in the window. It was, it was like the mountain was showing me when to shoot." "That's exactly right," Laney confirmed. "The mountain teaches everyone. You just learn to listen." By 1900 hours, all 4 Marines had successfully engaged the target using the Blackwood method. Not every shot was a hit. Learning to read complex environmental conditions took more than 6 hours of practice, but the success rate had jumped from 0% to nearly 70%. More importantly, they understood why they were succeeding. They had moved from blind reliance on technology to informed assessment of actual conditions, from shooting by numbers to shooting by understanding. As the sun touched the western ridgeline and painted the valley in shades of gold and red, Laney called a halt to live fire training. "We'll do night environmental reading after dinner," she said. "The principles are the same, but the visual cues are different. You'll learn to read star shimmer instead of heat mirage, to feel temperature gradients instead of seeing them." The Marines were exhausted but energized. Brennan looked at Laney with something approaching reverence. "Ma'am, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead, Staff Sergeant." "My brother Michael, when he died in Syria, if someone had taught his team these methods, would it have made a difference?" Laney was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. "Yes." The after-action report indicated they couldn't locate the enemy sniper because thermal conditions created false readings on their spotting equipment. If Michael had known to read the environment directly, he might have identified the position, might have made the shot that saved his team. "Thank you for telling me the truth," Brennan whispered. "Your brother was a good Marine and a good student," Laney said gently. "What happened to him wasn't his fault. It was a failure of institutional training. That's what I'm trying to fix." As darkness fell over Whiskey Ridge Range, 5 warriors gathered around a field table in the range office. Laney had ordered pizza, the most civilian action she'd taken all day, and they ate while continuing the instruction. Night vision techniques, reading star patterns for atmospheric disturbance, using temperature differentials to identify wind layers in darkness. Garrett sat slightly apart, still observing, still taking notes. Finally, he worked up the courage to speak. "Sergeant Major." Laney looked at him. "Yes, Gunny. I owe you an apology for this morning, for everything, the way I treated you, the things I said." "You were protecting your Marines the only way you knew how," Laney replied. "That instinct isn't wrong. The methods just needed adjustment." "I was a coward," Garrett said flatly, "hiding behind technology because I was afraid of making mistakes that would get people killed. Just like you said." "Then learn from it," Laney told him. "That's all any of us can do. I made mistakes in Afghanistan that got 8 Marines killed. I've spent 12 years trying to honor their memory by teaching others to survive what they didn't. You can do the same with the Marines you lost. Teach what they would have wanted you to teach." She reached into her pack and pulled out a worn notebook, its cover stained and pages dog-eared from years of use. "This is 12 years of training notes. Everything I learned at Quantico. Everything I developed in combat. Everything I've refined since. It's yours. Teach it. Pass it forward. Make sure the next generation doesn't die because they trusted their computers more than their eyes." Garrett took the notebook like it was a religious artifact. "Ma'am, I don't deserve—" "It's not about deserving. It's about what those young Marines downstairs need. They need instructors who understand that technology is a tool, not a crutch, who can teach adaptability along with a technique. Can you be that instructor?" Garrett met her eyes. "I'll try, ma'am. I swear I'll try. That's all I ask." At 2,300 hours, after 15 hours of the most intensive training any of them had ever experienced, Laney finally called it for the night. "Get some sleep. We'll do a final evaluation at 0600. After that," she trailed off, the unspoken extraction hanging in the air. The Marines headed to their barracks. Garrett walked towards his quarters. Laney stood alone on the range, looking at the 3 distant targets barely visible in starlight. She pulled out her phone, scrolling to a photo she kept locked in an encrypted folder. 8 Marines in combat gear, smiling despite the Afghanistan dust and heat. her team, her responsibility, her failure as she saw it. "I hope this counts," she whispered to the photo. "I hope teaching them helps balance what I couldn't do for you." The mountain wind blew its answer, speaking in a language only those who'd learned to listen could understand. Somewhere in that wind, in those invisible currents of air and temperature and pressure, was the truth that would either save four Marines in Syria or fail them the way she'd failed her team in Afghanistan. 24 hours to make the difference between life and death. 24 hours to pass on knowledge that had taken a lifetime to earn. 24 hours to prove that legends could still teach, that ghosts could still protect, that failure could somehow transform into redemption. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns. The mountain breathed its cycles. And on Whiskey Ridge Range, a woman who'd spent 18 months hiding behind a mop bucket stood ready to face one more dawn, teach one more lesson, and hope that this time everyone made it home alive. Dawn came to Whiskey Ridge Range like a promise that couldn't be broken. The October sun crested the eastern mountains at 0545, painting the California high desert in shades of amber and gold that made the granite peaks glow like they'd been forged in some celestial furnace. The air was cold enough to see breath, thin enough to make hearts work harder, clear enough to see for miles in every direction. Lainey had been awake since 0400, running through the final evaluation course she'd designed during the few hours she'd managed to sleep. Not the structured qualification test that Garrett's team had been failing for days, but something harder. Something that would actually prepare them for what waited in Syria. She'd repositioned targets throughout the valley, creating engagement scenarios that mimicked the mountain warfare conditions they'd face downrange. Multiple distances from 800 to 1,800 yards. Obscured positions requiring environmental reading to even identify targets. Time pressure requiring quick assessment rather than leisurely calculation. The kind of shooting that separated those who understood principles from those who'd merely memorized techniques. The Force Recon team arrived at 0550, 10 minutes early, their gear packed and ready for immediate deployment after the evaluation. They moved differently now than they had 24 hours ago. Slower, more deliberate, eyes constantly scanning the environment instead of locked on equipment readouts. Brennan's gaze traveled across the valley floor, reading patterns in the pre-dawn air movement. Caldwell studied the way steam rose from his coffee cup, using it as an improvised wind indicator. Whitfield stood facing east, eyes closed, feeling the temperature differential as the sun's first rays began warming the air. Even Garrett, officially an observer, was watching everything with the intensity of a man who'd been given a second chance and refused to waste it. "Gentlemen," Laney's voice carried clearly in the still morning air. "Your mission brief. Enemy forces have established multiple sniper positions in a mountain valley similar to this terrain. Intelligence suggests 3 to 5 shooters, Russian-trained, using advanced equipment and defensive positioning. Your task is to locate and neutralize all hostile positions within a 2-hour window. Rules of engagement: you must identify each target through environmental reading alone. Ballistic computers are authorized for confirmation only, not primary assessment. Questions?" Caldwell raised his hand. "Ma'am, how will we know if we've correctly identified target positions?" "I'll tell you when you're wrong," Laney replied with a slight smile, "which means every missed identification costs your team time and potentially lives, just like it will in Syria." The weight of that statement settled over them like a physical presence. This wasn't training anymore. This was rehearsal for survival. "Staff Sergeant Brennan, your team leader, set your plan." Brennan had been expecting this. Leadership under pressure, making decisions with incomplete information, trusting her training and her team. She moved to a vantage point overlooking the valley, studying terrain, with eyes that now saw patterns instead of empty space. Whitfield, primary shooter position, north end of the platform. Caldwell, secondary position, the south end. I'll spot for Whitfield first. Garrett spots for Caldwell. We work north to south, clearing suspected positions systematically. "Ma'am, permission to begin reconnaissance." "Granted, your time starts now." For the next 20 minutes, the team worked with a coordination that hadn't existed the day before. Brennan studied the valley through her spotting scope, but instead of relying on thermal imaging, she was reading environmental tells. A shimmer pattern that didn't match the surrounding airflow. Grass disturbed in a pattern inconsistent with natural wind. A shadow angle that suggested artificial concealment. "Contact," she called quietly. bearing 275 range approximately 1,300 yards. Thermal disturbance indicates possible hide position. Whitfield settled into his rifle, but instead of immediately checking his ballistic computer, he spent 30 seconds observing the wind conditions between his position and the target area. Reading surface wind at 10 miles per hour from the northeast, mid-level flow, he paused, watching heat shimmer and grass patterns. Mid-level is opposite, maybe 6 miles per hour from southwest. Thermal inversion present at approximately 900 yards. Confirmed. Brennan said, her scope tracking the same patterns. Window cycle approximately 50 seconds. Stand by for timing. They waited, not with the frustrated impatience of Marines fighting their equipment, but with the controlled patience of hunters who'd learned that the mountain had its own rhythm and fighting it was futile. Window opening in 10, 5, send it. Whitfield fired. 1,300 yards downrange, a steel target sang out with the distinctive clang of a center mass hit. Target neutralized, Laney confirmed. Continue. The evaluation continued for 90 minutes. The team identified 7 target positions scattered throughout the valley, engaging each one with a success rate that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. Not every shot was a first-round hit. Environmental reading was still new in Oahu. That assessment errors happened, but the pattern was clear. They were seeing what was real instead of what their equipment said should be real. At 0730, Brennan called the final target engagement. Last known position bearing 310 extreme range. Laser says 1,800 yards exactly. This one's going to be tight. Caldwell took the shot, his movements now showing the confidence of someone who trusted his training. He observed the environment for a full minute, reading patterns that would have been invisible to him a day ago, then fired during a 3-second window when the thermal layers aligned. The target rang true. Laney checked her stopwatch. Mission complete. Total time 1 hour 47 minutes. 7 targets, 7 hits, 0 civilian casualties. She looked up from the watch, her expression serious. That performance would have earned you a qualified rating at Quantico. More importantly, it demonstrates you've internalized the principles well enough to apply them under pressure. The relief that washed over the team was palpable. Brennan's shoulders sagged. Caldwell sat back from his rifle with a long exhale. Whitfield actually smiled for the first time since the evaluation began. But Garrett was still taking notes, his pen moving rapidly across pages that were already filled with observations and diagrams. Sergeant Major question. In the brief you mentioned Russian-trained snipers. What specific environmental reading techniques do Russian military use that differ from ours? It was a good question, the kind that showed Garrett was thinking beyond immediate qualification to long-term combat effectiveness. Laney appreciated that. Russian sniper doctrine emphasizes patience and environmental integration, she explained. They'll occupy a hide position for days, learning the microenvironment intimately. Every thermal cycle, every wind pattern, every atmospheric quirk. By the time they take a shot, they know that piece of terrain better than you know your own equipment. How do we counter that? Brennan asked. You become faster learners. You compress days of observation into hours through systematic assessment. The Blackwood method isn't about matching their patience, it's about matching their understanding of environment through more efficient observation and analysis. She gestured to the valley they'd just worked through. In Syria, you won't have days to learn the terrain. You'll have hours, maybe minutes. But if you can read wind layers, identify thermal patterns, and assess terrain effects quickly, you can achieve in 2 hours what takes them 2 days. Speed through understanding, not through rushing. Whitfield was studying the valley floor with new appreciation. Ma'am, these techniques, why aren't they standard training anymore? If they work this well, why did the Corps stop teaching them? Laney's expression darkened slightly. Because technology became cheaper and easier than expertise. Because computers could be issued to every Marine, but teaching environmental reading required time and skilled instructors. Because institutional inertia favors measurable solutions over effective ones. She paused, then continued with careful precision. When I left Quantico in 2015, the Blackwood method was considered the gold standard. But I was also expensive. Training took longer. Failure rates were higher initially because Marines had to learn to think instead of just calculate. The Corps decided they could achieve faster throughput with technology-focused training. And Marines started dying, Garrett said quietly. Not in training, in combat. where the difference between a computer's theoretical firing solution and the actual environmental reality means the difference between a hit and a miss, between mission success and body bags. The stark words hung in the morning air like an indictment. That's changing now, Laney continued. Your performance today and the performance of other teams I've assessed over the past 18 months is building the case for returning to environmental-focused training. The Marine Corps moves slowly, but it does eventually move toward what works. A vehicle was approaching from the base, kicking up dust on the access road. Black SUV government plates. Laney checked her watch. 0745. Right on schedule for her extraction. Agent Sterling emerged from the SUV along with two other DIA personnel Laney didn't recognize. Their expressions carried the professional neutrality of people executing an operation they'd rehearsed multiple times. Sergeant Major Blackwood, Sterling called as she approached the firing line. Transport is ready. We need to begin relocation protocols. Laney nodded, then turned back to her students. Gentlemen, you have 6 hours until your deployment transport departs. Use that time to practice what you've learned. Work through environmental scenarios. Build your confidence in the methodology. Ma'am, where are they taking you? Caldwell asked. Classified location for my protection. The surveillance teams that observed yesterday's demonstration have been tracked, but DIA wants me relocated until threat assessment is complete. Brennan stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion she was barely controlling. Sergeant Major, I need you to know something. My brother, Michael, what you taught us here, what you tried to teach him at Quantico. He talked about you in every email. Said you were the reason he felt prepared for combat. When he died, I was angry. Angry at the Marine Corps, at the instructors, at everyone who'd sent him downrange. She paused, gathering herself. But now I understand. You gave him the tools. The Corps took them away by changing the curriculum. That's not your failure. That's institutional failure. And what you've done here, teaching us in 24 hours, was what might save our lives. That's honoring his memory better than any memorial service ever could. Laney's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. She stepped forward and placed both hands on Brennan's shoulders. Your brother was a warrior. He died doing what warriors do, protecting his team as long as he could. That's not failure. That's sacrifice. Remember him that way. And come home alive so his sacrifice wasn't in vain. Yes, ma'am, Brennan whispered. Laney moved to each Marine in turn, offering final words that were both practical advice and something deeper, the kind of wisdom that only came from surviving what they were about to face. To Caldwell. Those twins need their father more than they need stories about his courage. Smart decisions, patient shots, and coming home alive. That's your mission. To Whitfield, your father served with honor. Now you carry that forward. Trust your training, trust your eyes, and trust that he's proud of you, regardless of the outcome. To Garrett, last and longest. You asked me earlier how I live with losing my team. The truth is I don't. Not really, but I've learned that honoring the fallen means keeping the living alive. That's your mission now. Teach what I've taught you, pass it forward. Make sure the next generation learns to see what's real. She handed him a small leather-bound journal, separate from the training notebook she'd given him the night before. This is personal. My thoughts about each of my Marines who died in Kunar. What they taught me. What I wish I'd taught them. Read it when you doubt yourself. Remember that even legends fail, but failure only becomes permanent when you stop trying to learn from it. Garrett took the journal like it was made of crystal. Ma'am, I swear I'll honor this trust. I know you will. That's why I'm giving it to you. Sterling was checking her watch with increasing frequency. Sergeant Major, we really need to move. Laney nodded, then walked to her battered Ford F-150 and retrieved her rifle case one final time. She carried it to the firing line and set it down in front of the 4 Marines. This rifle has been my companion for 6 years. Every adjustment, every modification, every round fired, they're all part of my story. I want it to become part of yours. She looked at Brennan. Staff Sergeant, this is yours now. Take it to Syria. Make shots with it that I'll never hear about but will somehow know happened. Bring it home, then pass it to the next warrior who needs to learn that excellence isn't about equipment, it's about understanding. Brennan's hands shook as she accepted the rifle case. Ma'am, I can't possibly. You can and you will. That rifle has saved lives. Let it save yours. The moment stretched between them, heavy with significance that went beyond metal and glass, beyond technology and technique. This was the passing of something that couldn't be quantified, the transfer of warrior wisdom from one generation to the next, from teacher to student, from survivor to those who still had battles to fight. Sterling's patience had reached its limit. Sergeant Major, the clock is now an issue. Laney straightened her shoulders, going back in a posture that was pure Marine Corps, despite the civilian clothes she still wore. She rendered a salute that was sharp and precise and carried 12 years of service in its execution. The four Marines snapped to attention and returned it, holding the gesture until Laney dropped her hand. Semper Fidelis, she said quietly. Semper Fi, ma'am, they responded in unison. Then she was walking toward the SUV, her movement still carrying that economy of motion that spoke of 1,000 training cycles and combat operations that would never appear in any official record. She climbed into the back seat without looking back, and the vehicle accelerated away down the access road, trailing dust that hung in the still morning air like a ghost. For a long moment, nobody spoke. They just stood there, four Marines and one former instructor, watching the SUV disappear into the desert distance. Finally, Garrett broke the silence. All right, 6 hours until departure. Let's use them. 3 weeks later, the morning sun in Syria rose over mountains that looked nothing like California, and everything like every other place where warriors had learned that survival required more than courage. The mountain range northwest of Al-Tamf was a maze of ridgelines and valleys where the wind moved in patterns that computers couldn't predict and equipment couldn't measure, where enemy snipers had pinned down U.S. forces for weeks, killing with a precision that suggested training and patience and intimate knowledge of terrain. Forward Operating Base Granite was a collection of hardened structures and defensive positions carved into a mountainside home to a company of Marines and an assortment of Special Operations Forces who were trying to clear enemy combatants from supply routes in civilian areas. The morning briefing room was crowded with personnel from multiple units, all gathered to hear about the latest disaster. Gentlemen, we have a serious problem. Captain Rodriguez addressed the assembled warriors, his face showing the strain of command decisions that carried life and death weight. Echo Company's 2nd Platoon is pinned down in Grid Charlie 7. They've got 2 KIA-4 WIA, and they cannot extract under current conditions. Enemy sniper has them locked in a kill zone. He gestured to a satellite photo showing the valley where Echo Company was trapped. The sniper is Russian-trained, extremely patient, and has intimate knowledge of this terrain. He's been active in this area for 6 weeks, 8 confirmed kills, 13 wounded. Every attempt to locate him has failed. Thermal imaging shows nothing. Ballistic computers can't predict his position based on firing angles. He shoots, he kills, and he disappears. From the back of the room, Gunnery Sergeant Wade Garrett studied the terrain photo with eyes that now saw patterns instead of just geography. The valley configuration, the sun angle, the way shadows fell across the ridgelines, it all suggested environmental factors that would create the same kind of thermal complexity they'd trained on at Whiskey Ridge. So request permission to deploy counter-sniper team. Rodriguez turned relief evident in his expression. Gunny Garrett, your force recon team just arrived in country yesterday. You haven't even completed area familiarization. With respect, sir, my team has trained specifically for this kind of environmental complexity. We can find him. Rodriguez studied him for a long moment, then nodded. You've got 2 hours to locate and neutralize the threat. After that, Echo Company has to attempt extraction under fire, and will lose more Marines. Clear. Crystal, sir. 30 minutes later, Garrett's team was in position on a ridgeline overlooking the valley where Echo Company was trapped. The sun was higher now, heating the dark rocks and creating the thermal conditions that turned mountain warfare into a three-dimensional chess game played with invisible pieces. Brennan had her spotting scope up, but she wasn't looking at thermal imaging or equipment readouts. She was reading the environment the way Laney had taught her. Grass patterns at multiple distances, heat shimmer rising off rocks, the way dust moved in currents that suggested wind layers at different altitudes. Something's off about the thermal pattern at 1,100 yards bearing 295, she said quietly. The mirage flow is wrong for natural conditions. Caldwell positioned behind Laney's rifle the precision Remington 700 that had made an impossible shot 3 weeks earlier, studied the same area. Confirmed, that shimmer pattern suggests artificial heat source, probably body heat from a hide position that's been occupied for hours. Range, Garrett asked. 1,500 yards exactly. Caldwell replied, his voice steady. Wind conditions are chaotic. Surface wind is 8 miles per hour from the east, but mid-level flow is reversed. Thermal inversion is present at approximately 1,000 yards. It was exactly the kind of condition that would have defeated them a month ago. Multiple wind layers, thermal complexity, atmospheric conditions that made ballistic computer solutions unreliable at best and dangerously wrong at worst. But they weren't the same Marines who'd failed 127 consecutive shots on a California range. They were warriors who'd learned to see what was real instead of what their equipment said should be real. I can make the shot, Caldwell said with quiet confidence, but I need to time the thermal cycle. It's longer here than Whiskey Ridge, about 70 seconds instead of 45. Take your time, Garrett replied. And the fact that he said those words, the man who 3 weeks ago had demanded perfection and speed above all else, spoke to how much had changed. Caldwell settled into the rifle, his body assuming the position that Laney had refined through 1,000 teaching sessions. He controlled his breathing, found his natural respiratory pause, and began the patient observation that separated those who understood from those who merely calculated. He watched the mirage patterns at multiple distances, observed grass movement in the valley below, studied dust devils that appeared and disappeared in rhythms that revealed the mountain's breathing. For 60 seconds, he didn't move, just gathered information with eyes that had learned to see patterns in chaos. Thermal cycle completing, he announced quietly. Window in 15 seconds. 10, 5. Halfway across the world in a secure facility, whose location was classified above top secret, Laney Blackwood was reviewing reports on her tablet when something made her look up. A feeling impossible to quantify but impossible to ignore. The sense that somewhere someone was applying lessons she'd taught, that knowledge was transferring into action, that maybe, just maybe this time, everyone would make it home. She touched the dog tags under her shirt, the ones that belonged to 8 Marines who hadn't made it home from Afghanistan 12 years ago, and whispered a prayer to whatever force governs survival in combat zones. In Syria, Caldwell whispered firing and squeezed the trigger during a 3-second window when thermal layers aligned in and the mountain's breath held steady. 1,500 yards downrange, a Russian-trained sniper who'd killed 8 Americans and wounded 13 more took a 175-grain Sierra Match King bullet through the center of his scope. The fight ended in the time it took the sound of the shot to echo off valley walls. Target neutralized, Brennan confirmed through her spotting scope. Echo Company is clear for extraction. The radio crackled with confirmation. Echo Company was moving casualties, being evacuated Marines who would have died in that valley, making it to medical treatment because one shooter had learned to read wind patterns that computers couldn't measure. Garrett keyed his mic to command frequency. Granite 6, this is Reaper 1. Enemy sniper eliminated. Echo Company is clear for Casevac. How copy? The response was immediate and filled with relief. Reaper 1, Granite 6 copies all. Outstanding work. Return to base for debrief. As the team packed their equipment, Caldwell ran his hand along the stock of Laney's rifle, his rifle now earned through dedication and proven through combat. She knew, he said quietly. Sergeant Major Blackwood knew this exact situation would happen. That's why she pushed us so hard on thermal reading. She knew because she'd been here before, Garrett replied, his voice carrying the weight of understanding earned through failure and redemption. Different country, different war, but the same mountains, the same wind, the same truth that equipment can't see, but warriors can learn to read. That night, back at FOB Granite, Garrett sat in his makeshift workspace and opened the leather journal Laney had given him. Her personal thoughts about the 8 Marines who died under her command in Afghanistan. He read each entry, slowly absorbing lessons written in pain and refined through 12 years of survivor's guilt. Then he pulled out his own notebook and began writing. Not official after-action reports, but personal observations. What Caldwell had done right, how Brennan's environmental assessment had identified a threat that equipment had missed, the way Whitfield's patience under pressure had allowed his teammates to work at the speed of competence rather than the speed of panic. Lessons that would be passed forward to the next generation. Wisdom earned through combat and teaching, and the understanding that survival wasn't about perfection, it was about adaptation. 6 months passed. The Force Recon team completed 3 rotations in Syria, engaging enemy combatants in conditions that ranged from mountain warfare to urban operations. They made shots in sandstorms and heat that made equipment fail in cold, that froze computer batteries in terrain, that created wind patterns no algorithm could predict. They came home with zero casualties. The citation for their Navy Commendation Medal mentioned exceptional performance under combat conditions and innovative application of advanced marksmanship techniques. It didn't mention Lainey Blackwood because her involvement remained classified. It didn't mention the 24 hours at Whiskey Ridge because officially that training had never happened. But Garrett knew, his team knew, and somewhere in a classified facility reviewing reports from multiple combat zones where her methodology was saving lives, Lainey knew. The foreign surveillance teams that had observed Lainey's demonstration were eventually identified as Russian GRU operatives attempting to map retired U.S. Special Operations personnel. DIA's counterintelligence operation, triggered by Lainey's exposure, led to the arrest of 3 intelligence officers and the expulsion of 7 Russian diplomats from the U.S. The threat that had forced Lainey's extraction had inadvertently exposed a larger espionage network. Colonel Thatcher would later note in classified reports that her blown cover had been operationally costly but strategically valuable. But those details remain locked in classified files. What mattered to Lainey was simpler. She was free to teach again without looking over her shoulder. 18 months after the impossible shot that had revealed her identity, Lainey stood in front of 42 Marine recruits at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, Quantico. She wore her service uniform with Sergeant Major rank insignia and enough ribbons to cover most of her chest. The recruits looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and confusion, a woman instructor in a traditionally male domain, someone whose reputation preceded her, but whose full story remained classified. "I'm Sergeant Major Elaine Blackwood," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned respect through action rather than rank. "I'm going to teach you to kill the enemy at distances they can't touch you. But more importantly, I'm going to teach you to see what's real instead of what your equipment tells you should be real." She gestured to a photograph mounted on the wall behind her. 8 Marines in combat gear smiling despite Afghanistan dust and heat. "These warriors died under my command 12 years ago. I've spent every day since trying to honor their memory by making sure you don't die the same way. That means teaching you hard truths about environmental assessment, about the limitations of technology, and about the responsibility you carry when you accept the sniper designation." Next to her stood Gunnery Sergeant Wade Garrett, now assigned as Assistant Chief Instructor after 18 months of proving he could teach the Blackwood method with the same dedication she demanded. His journey from harsh disciplinarian to thoughtful educator had been documented in reports that highlighted institutional training reforms across the Marine Corps. "Gunnery Sergeant Garrett will assist with instruction," Laney continued. "He's forgotten more about environmental ballistics than most of you will ever learn. Listen to him, learn from him, and remember that the best instructors are those who've learned from their mistakes, rather than pretending they never made any." Over the following weeks, the class learned what 4 Force Recon Marines had compressed into 24 hours. How to read thermal inversions and wind layers, how to identify environmental patterns that indicated sniper positions, how to make shots when computers failed and equipment gave contradictory data, how to trust their observations over their technology when the two didn't align. They learned the Blackwood method not as a replacement for modern technology, but as a foundation that made technology useful rather than limiting. Ballistic computers confirmed what eyes and experience had already determined. Weather stations measured conditions that environmental assessment had already identified. Equipment served the warrior instead of the warrior serving the equipment. On graduation day, as 42 newly designated Marine Scout snipers stood at attention to receive their qualification, Laney stood at the podium with a photograph in her hands. Not the official class photo, but a personal image she'd carried for 12 years. 8 warriors who hadn't made it home. "You're entering a profession that demands excellence and punishes failure with blood," she told the graduates. "You'll make shots that save lives and miss shots that haunt you forever. You'll be called heroes and you'll feel like failures. That's the burden of the sniper designation. But if you remember what we've taught you here, to see clearly, to think critically, to adapt constantly, then you have the foundation for not just survival, but excellence." She looked at Garrett, who nodded his understanding and support. Then she looked at each graduate in turn, making eye contact that carried the weight of personal investment in their future success. Some of you will face impossible situations where equipment fails and technology betrays you. In those moments, remember that the mountain doesn't lie. Physics is consistent. Truth exists in environmental reality rather than digital display. Trust your training, trust your eyes, trust that the lessons learned here will serve you even when everything else fails. Semper Fidelis, she concluded. Semper Fidem. 42 voices responded in unison. After the ceremony, Laney walked to the far end of the Quantico Ranges, where three steel targets stood at distances of 1,700, 2,000, and 2,200 yards. The same configuration she'd used to make an impossible shot 18 months earlier. The shot that had compromised her cover and changed everything. Garrett found her there standing quietly and looking at the distant targets. Sergeant Major, the Commandant wants to see you before you leave. I'm not leaving, Laney replied. I'm staying. This is where I belong, teaching the next generation, passing forward what my Marines taught me through their sacrifice. What did they teach you? Laney was quiet for a long moment, gathering thoughts that had taken 12 years to articulate. That failure isn't permanent unless you stop learning from it. That honor isn't about perfection, it's about continuing to serve even after you've been broken. That the best way to remember the fallen is by keeping the living alive. She turned to face Garrett directly. You asked me once how I live with losing my team. The truth is, I do it by teaching. Every Marine who graduates and comes home alive, that's one small piece of redemption. One small way of honoring what my team gave. It doesn't erase the failure, doesn't bring them back, doesn't make the survivor's guilt disappear, but it makes the burden bearable. Thank you for teaching me that, Garrett said quietly, both the marksmanship and the wisdom. You learned it because you were willing to admit you needed to learn. That's harder than any shot, harder than any tactical skill. The courage to acknowledge you were wrong and to change. Never lose that Wade. It's what makes you an instructor worth learning from. They stood there together as the sun set over the Quantico Ranges, two warriors who'd found their way back to purpose through teaching, through sacrifice, through the understanding that some missions couldn't be measured in enemy casualties or tactical victories, but in the quiet success of students who came home alive. On a distant ridgeline, three steel targets caught the last rays of sunlight and gleamed like promises waiting to be kept. The mountain wind blew its eternal patterns across the valley, carrying truths that only those who'd learned to listen could understand. And in the growing darkness, two legends stood ready to face another dawn, teach another class and hope that this time and every time after everyone made it home. The impossible shot had become legend. But the real impossibility had been learning to teach again, after loss to trust again, after failure to believe again, after tragedy. That knowledge could be passed forward in ways that honored the fallen by protecting the living. Some stories ended with triumphant returns and ticker tape parades. This one ended with quiet dedication in a place where warriors learned to see truth in wind patterns and wisdom in mountain breath, where technology served rather than ruled, where the fallen were honored not through monuments, but through the survival of those who came after. And somewhere in the archives of Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, in a display case that few recruits noticed, but every instructor understood, stood a precision rifle that had made an impossible shot and saved countless lives. Not through magic or superhuman skill, but through the simple act of teaching warriors to see what was real instead of what they wished was true. The mountain didn't lie. It never had. It just waited for those humble enough to learn its language, patient enough to observe its patterns, and wise enough to pass that knowledge forward to the next generation of warriors who would face their own impossible moments and need the courage to trust what their eyes showed them over what their computers promised. Semper Fidelis, always faithful to the mission, to the fallen, to the living who still had battles to fight and homes to return to the truth that existed in environmental reality rather than digital display, to the understanding that the best way to honor sacrifice was through teaching, through wisdom, through the patient transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. The story of the impossible shot would be told for years, but the real story, the one that mattered, was written in the lives of warriors who came home because someone had cared enough to teach them to see. That was the legacy. That was the mission. That was the truth that would outlast legends and last as long as warriors needed wisdom to survive the mountains that never lied the wind, that never ceased, in the eternal struggle to read reality clearly enough to make the difference between life and death.